So good afternoon. I hope you had a good rest and that we can now start again for this International Scientist School on ICP. This morning in my talk and followed by Jean-Philippe, we introduce the change in the different approach of crop protection and then the principles of ACP. We mention that IPM was developed with a high challenge to merge chemical control and biological control. But even if it was supported by the FAO, even if it moved to the southern countries, it tried to keep in consideration the emergence of the big challenge of pest resistance to pesticide and the treatment thresholds. It has been implemented since over than 50 years, and we can now say that IPM is more and more recognized as non-compatible with biological control. Why? Once again, it was developed to try to mix biological control with chemical control. So the question is, how can we explain this failure and what should be the next step? I will focus mainly on explanation about this failure. Speaking about the concept of IPM, at the origin, integrated control and IPM had a very ambitious objective to conciliate or to harmonize, or why not to say to integrate chemical control with biological control. I said this morning that regarding chemical control, we are facing negative impact, which started to be shown since the 60s with the book of Carson, and regarding the biological control, which had some success. With the time, IPM shows some evolution in the keywords regarding this approach, moving a bit more on a global approach, means managing pest population more than directly pest insect, and evolving also with a more systematical approach, but still showing a clear link regarding ecology approach or even speaking about beneficials. The failure should be also explained by a lack of clarity. It's still a nebulous status and involving a lot of confusions. Since it has been implemented until now, we have more than 100 definitions for one approach. Means that anytime we change a little bit, we put a new definitions. So how can the farmers, how can the decision maker get a good knowledge, a good sense of what is IPM? It's also probably a big part in the explanation of the failure. Through the evolution in the definition, we have a notion of continuum. According to the number and relative importance of the alternative techniques that are implemented in addition to the chemical control. So we speak about low IPM, or moderate IPM, or even high IPM, and so on. There is also a notion of truth. And according to the level of attention given to the interaction and compatibility between techniques developed, we speak about truly IPM, and sometimes according to the level of the chemical pressure, because we are still working with chemical pesticide, about false IPM or true IPM. So for the users, what is really IPM? There is still a big problem of definition and interpretation. This conduct to speak now about kind or categories of IPM, and we can hear about conventional IPM, preventive IPM, community IPM, and sometimes zero IPM. But we should say that today, most of the crop protection cases are called IPM, and we should say also that most of the crop protection cases are related to the use of chemicals. Compatibility between chemical and biological control. It was the big challenge that made the IPM rise in the last years. If we consider to what happened in France, we can say that we are using more and more pesticide. This is true not only in France, but quite in all countries. And in Asia, we are well aware that the increase of chemicals is very, very important. And most, we are speaking of excess of use for pesticide. Is it an addiction? And what is the real place for biological control or even just biocontrol? What is sure is if you want to use what we consider as the useful insect or the beneficials to help to control a pest, how can we use them? How can we increase them when we use chemicals that in fact kill all the insects, both pests and beneficials? So the incompatibility is now more and more recognized, and the fundamentals of IPM trying to cross the use of chemicals and biological control is now known as not effective. And as Jean-Philippe said just before going for lunch, speaking about ACP, it is based on a significant reduction or even suppression of pesticide, and also to adopt safe cultural practices for beneficials. So it is really an important point. Integrating, harmonizing, combining, juxtaposing elements or techniques. Once again, it is not clear in definition and concept, in the research studies, or even in practice, and of course, at the level of the policies. In most of the cases, we should say that we have just juxtaposition or combinations. Little attention is paid to interaction or compatibility of the techniques. And even in the definitions, which is supposed to be the basement, it's just a list, or in most of the case, it is just a list of techniques rarely following an order. What are the references? In the books, there are books, but most of the time, it's just a list of characteristics of the techniques. And in practice, what's happened in the field? It's IPM is much often dominated by single technologies. We should say addition of techniques based, for most of them, on a chemical approach, which make us speak then about false IPM or moderate IPM. It is most of the time combination of elements and never integrations. What about research? As we know, it's also important to improve our knowledge. What about research for IPM? Regarding the biological control and the chemical control, we should now say clearly that both approaches have been conducted as parallel stories and never trying really to combine these two approaches. We have plenty case of separate studies instead of searching for synergy between the two approaches. In terms of practice, of course, it's an approach dealing with the crop protection, but is it pest population management? Is it pesticide management? Or is it ecological balance management? In fact, the question is, when are you really in the IPM approach? And under IPM, once again, in most of the cases in the field, we have an agrochemical base with, of course, different techniques using different varieties, crop sequences, biopesticide, and so on. And once again, this wide range of possibilities make us speak about false IPM, low IPM, and so on. The definition is not clear. What about the adoption of IPM? We should say now, and it is recognized, even if supported by FAO, which put a lot of effort to implement the IPM in the world, that globally we have a low adoption of IPM in the world. And now we hear more and more about low adoption, illusion of IPM, disillusionment with IPM, or sometimes good intention but hard reality. If we try to see what happened in some developed countries, and for example in USA, there were really good intentions at the beginning. For example, in 1970s, we had the Nixon directive. IPM becomes the national policy, so very strong position of a government. 23 years later, the Clinton commitment to extend the practice of IPM to 75% by the year 2000. A good challenge. What is the reality? We should say it's a hard reality. In 2000, consumers estimated IPM adoption was just 4 to 8%. What about the 75% of the Clinton commitment? Today, agriculture is still mostly based on agrochemistry. Why? Probably because of a strong lack of pluridisciplinarity and integration. A strong lack of knowledge on non-chemical practice. Most of the effort from research, training, was put on chemical controls. And now there is a call for an ecological approach to agrosystem function rather than an objective to treat symptoms and a more dynamic consideration of tolerance thresholds. In Europe, we had a directive to make all the agriculture areas under IPM on the 1st of January 2014. But on the 31st December of 2013, it was not a reality. What happened in the night? Something magic? What about the adoption of IPM in the south? Still the same, very low adoption. And for example, in Vietnam, we know that for the rice, which is one of the most important crops for Vietnam, and even if the IPM was pushed to reduce the use of chemicals, in fact, the adoption was very low because the farmer didn't understand what is IPM. They consider IPM as no chemicals, and they had to face some problem of pest and disease. So they knew that if they do nothing, they will lose their crops and, of course, their money. So there was a lack of integration of technique in the field. There was a lack of knowledge for farmers and lack of training and action to develop this IPM approach. And, of course, a lack of implication of small-scale farmers, as we know that in the south, most of the farms are of small size. Regarding the global adoption of IPM, whether in the north or in the south, we should say that there is still a ease and habit in using pesticide. It is so easy to apply, so easy to buy, and of course, with most of the time, efficient effect. There are a lot of progress in the knowledge of chemical control, very few in the biological control. There is still a lack of concept guidelines. The farmers don't know what to do exactly. There is still a gap between concept, science, policies, business, and practices. Business is very important as the pesticide farm have a lot of money and can make a lot of advertising. They help the farmers. Sometimes they provide the chemicals, letting them pay later on when they will harvest and so on. So they offer so many facilities that it's, once again, difficult to move out of this system. And training course on IPM was given by professionals from chemical industry. So how can you be, in one hand, a seller, and in another hand, people to promote a reduction in use of chemicals? So, consequence, IPM practice are not coherent with objectives of sustainability and are not sustainable. About research, there is a need to join experiences in IPM to research. Empiric knowledge from the farmers and scientific knowledge. Scientific discoveries are needed for advancing IPM, but clearly are not sufficient for establishing IPM in the field, as we need that the farmers follow us. In terms of research, as I already said, we did a lot of progress in the knowledge of the chemical control, which allowed to reduce the use of the most dangerous one, reduction in quantity, precaution to take to reduce the health risk, but all this progress paradoxally reinforce the role of the chemical control in crop protection. As, for example, if we know better how to use it, we should find it safer. Speaking about research, we have to consider the ISS approach in crop protection. E for efficiency, chemical control, it's again pest. But in practice, very low reduction of pesticide, just few percentage. Substitution, to substitute chemical control by alternatives method using physical, mechanical, biological, cultural controls. We should focus a bit more on biopesticide, for example. But it is still in the same kind of process using a pesticide which have direct and collateral effect. For redesign, it is also important to consider that we have to change our way of mind. We have to redesign what we have to do and to take into consideration that today we have to work in a global ecosystem. We don't need to produce as much as possible. We need to produce, of course. Food security is still the challenge. But we have to balance the way we are doing to take much better into consideration the agro ecosystem. Consistency. Jean-Philippe, just before lunch, spoke about consistency. What is the gap between what we say and what we are doing? Globally, for IPM, we should say that what has been said and what has been done is globally not consistent. Speaking now about ecology, we should say that the word ecology is a bit prohibited in the approach of IPM, unfortunately. There is a clear lack of ecology in the definitions and in practice of IPM. And what is a bit linked with ecology, in most of the cases, is regarding some notions of epidemiology, population dynamics, or even to reduce negative impacts of environment, but never about a global agro-system. So where is ecology in IPM? A lot of books, publications were written speaking about IPM, but very few really concerned with ecology in crop protection. Fortunately, it's changing a bit now since a few years, and we have more and more books speaking about ecological approach. And the one which is was the last published is the one that was given to you recently, which is Agroecological Crop Protection by Jean-Philippe Deguine and Jean-Noël Auberteau, who are both with us for this scientist school. Going to a short conclusion. Is it a paradigm shift? What are the current and future issues? For sure, the priority for agriculture is still the sustainability, bringing to the more ecological sustainability. There is a real need to change. That's what we said. There is a clear need also to take into account issues of sustainable development, not only sustainable agriculture, but sustainable development, including social, economical, and environmental aspects. And one more point important is the clear necessity today to take into consideration the societal issue and the human right concerning pesticide, which is directly linked with health. And as Jean-Philippe said before lunch, there is now more and more case of disease, human disease, related to the use of pesticides. So if we want to answer to these issues, it is needed to apply ecology in agrosystem, which is clearly agroecology, and to apply agroecology to crop protection, which is clearly agroecological crop protection. We need to do that not only by speaking by words, but we now really need also to apply that. So I will not speak more about agroecological protection, as Jean-Philippe presented to you the basement of ACP. Just want to focus on some very important keywords. We have to consider that we need a sustainable functioning of agrosystems. So sustainable agrosystems, so something global. ACP is the declension of the principle of agroecology in crop protection. It is based on biodiversity, both for plant and animal, and soil health. In terms of practices, it is based on 3 pillars: preventive measures, conservation biological control, which is the center of gravity of this approach, and habitat management of the habitat and inhabitants, of course, which is decline in cultural practice. I give you a lot of information about the failure of IPM. It is not that we want to prosecute or lawsuit against IPM. I think it's just time to realize how necessary it is to evolve in the concepts, in the policies, in research, in practice, with a clear common thread, and in works, but also in needs and practice. And we have also to take into consideration that in a short future, I don't know if it will be next year, in the next decade, but we have to anticipate what is coming for sure, the prohibition of pesticide use. Thank you for your attention.